Welcome to the Visible Risk Masterclass series on cyber risk quantification. I'm Jack Freund. Today, we'll be talking about the common pitfalls to avoid when implementing CRQ in your organization. One of the biggest problems with CRQ assessments is that they're improperly scoped. What this really means is that the scenario that's under evaluation does not accurately reflect the things it needs to in order to allow for CRQ computations. Most of the time, this is because the scenario is not business focused. We focus on things that are very specific, like cross-site scripting or password spraying. But we don't put that in the context of a larger business environment to better understand what the impact's going to be. Remember the formula. We have to know who's doing something, what they're doing, what assets are at risk, and what's the business impact. Recasting the cybersecurity assessment you're doing in terms of this broader sentence, this natural language sentence that tells you what's going on, is an important part of making sure that it's properly scoped. Oftentimes, when doing risk assessments, assessment professionals will conflate missing, broken, or weak controls with a fully qualified risk scenario. So instead of asking, what's the risk associated with improper permissions, the organization should be assessing, what's the risk associated with improper permissions on this customer portal when under attack by cyber criminals that are trying to exfiltrate our data. That gives you all the components that are necessary to make sure that you can assess things quantitatively. In the ISO 27005 risk assessment standard, they have a process bubble before risk analysis called context establishment. Think about it like that. The thing that you're concerned about, be it a missing control, a broken control, a weak control, needs to be properly contextualized within the broader business environment to better assess it. Once you have a properly articulated scenario for analysis, the next step is to make sure we put the right data against it. Oftentimes, this is a big pitfall when organizations are doing CRQ assessments. One of the biggest complaints is that the numbers we're putting against these assessments are just guesses. Indeed, they could be if they didn't follow the right process. It's important to hold workshops with people who know the right data in the organization. Business executives, chief privacy officers, cybersecurity professionals working in threat intelligence and control analysis. To get them into these workshops, we have to make sure that they're able to properly assess and estimate the things that we're asking them to do. So for example, when we're asking somebody to estimate what we think the range of losses associated with this are, it's important to give them the tools to do this. This type of workshop allows us to move from merely guessing to having a much better articulated estimate of what we think those losses look like. Ask them questions like, how much do you think this is going to cost? And then challenge their answers by saying things like, is that the least it can be or the most it can be? This helps them to better frame their thinking around things. Oftentimes we go into these types of assessments with a little bit of bias and understanding, and we try and fix a point that we think is the right thing. Helping people verbally understand better that they can articulate their potential losses in ranges is very, very important. Same thing with threat intelligence. We start talking about how often we think these attackers are going to come at our assets in our organization. Help them understand that they can think about this and express this in terms of ranges. Is it once a month? Is it 5 times a month? What type of attacks? How often? To what degree? These are very important questions to help them better calibrate themselves to understand what those ranges look like. Ultimately, this type of thing is called SME elicitation and has value and is used broadly in a lot of parts of the organization that are doing sales forecasting, and especially in operational risk. And in financial services companies, they use it a lot in scenario analysis when they're trying to do capital allocation. It's okay to do this because it's foundational in a lot of other parts of the organization in the disciplines that they're using to articulate things for their organization. Ultimately, estimated data is not as good as real data. So if you have real data, by all means, it's important to use that. Sometimes this means that you have to record data over time to make sure that you have it available when you need it. This means that you can think about recording incidents and asking questions as an event is happening around what the loss is, who we think the attacker was, which controls failed. This is perfect data to be used as input in the CRQ functions, if you have it. If you don't have real data, you can also use peer data. Sometimes this is just as good, especially for organizations that are as much like you as possible. Sometimes executives in your organizations have friends or have industry groups where they share information and stories. This type of narrative storytelling is important to better understand the types of losses that may incur what are the source of those losses, and how much money is at risk. These things can also be recorded and marked as such in your database of potential incidents. All of these things cumulatively, actual loss data, losses by your peers, and estimated losses, are important to better understand the type of data that can be used for your organization. CRQ assessment methodologies do not have a control catalog. This makes it really important that you leverage one in the assessments that you're doing. Indeed, all of the assessment frameworks that you see here have the ability for you to use CRQ methodologies in your assessments. But the inverse is not true. CRQ methodologies do not have a list of controls that can be applied to them. They may have categories of controls. They may have types of controls and where it fits in the calculation. But as a specific list of things that can go wrong, they don't have them. So it's important that you pick one that's meaningful for your organization, and one that's required by your primary regulator is an important place to start. Control standard alignment also helps make sure that the data that you're using for your assessments is high quality. In the assessments that your organization is already doing, they're most likely aligned to one of these standards. So thinking about the types of testing that's being done, aligning them to control standards, and then aligning those control standards to the scenarios that we've already articulated is an important part of building out a larger CRQ framework. This does two things. One, it allows you to collect empirical data about the control state in your organization that is already aligned to your scenarios. But the inverse works as well. This means that for any particular scenario that you have attached to an IT asset, you can give them a punch list, a requirements list of the types of controls that are necessary for the deployment of that asset. In other words, you've given them a checklist of things that they need to do to be secure. And you're also letting them know ahead of time that these are the things that you're going to be assessing against when you compute risk on their asset. The last pitfall when people deploy CRQ is to not think about aggregation. Generally, people start with these big categories in their head: data disclosure, fraud, business interruption. And CRQ methodologies implore you to think about decomposing that into a much more granular scenario that allows for analysis, the types of fully qualified risks statements that we've talked about here. But we do still have to categorize them so we can roll them back up. While it's important to have that natural language sentence that I mention all the time when we're thinking about risk assessments at this granular level, we can't provide a list of 100 scenarios like that to our executives. Indeed, when they think about risk, they're thinking about them in terms of those kind of scenarios that we start with: data disclosure, business interruption, fraud. The important thing to do is to categorize the scenarios underneath those big headings to allow them to be rolled up later. What this means is that you have a scenario that talks about the types of data disclosure that exist in the organization for every particular asset and threat actor that is important to you. What this allows us to do is provide a list of, let's call it 50 different scenarios that allows organizations to pick from when they're trying to articulate better their data disclosure risk. Organizations can aggregate this using some simple math. One of two approaches works well. The first is that we pick an exemplar out of that list of scenarios that represents the greater category. So for example, if you have 50 scenarios and one of them represents the highest potential losses, that loss amount can be articulated and aggregated up to that overall category. So of those 50, if one of them says 50 million and the other says 10 and 20, we're going to pick the one that's 50 million, and that becomes the amount of risk associated with our overall aggregated data disclosure risk. Another approach, more sophisticated, oftentimes employed by financial services companies, is to build a state table that better understands what the overlap is between all these scenarios. For example, if one scenario has a 10% overlap with another scenario, we'll reduce that amount. This allows us to better sum all the scenarios underneath that aggregated category to allow us to have a much more particular view of what that loss would look like if they all happened at the same time. That's a complicated approach. A lot of organizations don't do that. Instead, I advise the exemplar approach is the best way to do it. Pick a sample from the underlying scenarios. Use that one to represent the whole. That's it for this session on how to avoid common CRQ pitfalls. Join me next time as we'll talk about ways to optimize and evaluate your current CRQ program. Thank you.